In the year 859, dozens of northern ships approached the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. Behind them lay the exposed waters of the Atlantic. Ahead stood Seville, one of the richest cities in Muslim Spain, and the site of a Viking triumph that Al-Andalus had never forgotten. Later chroniclers would remember 62 vessels at the beginning of this expedition, though no one can say how many remained together when the fleet reached the river. Nor can we identify its commanders with certainty. Medieval tradition eventually attached two famous names to the voyage, Björn Ironside and Hastein, but the contemporary records are far less generous. To the people watching from shore, the names did not matter. The direction of the ships did. 15 years earlier, another Viking fleet had entered the same river and sailed deep into the country. Those raiders had captured much of Seville, killed or enslaved many of the people unable to escape, and used the occupied districts as a base for attacks across the surrounding valley. The city had eventually been recovered, but only after an army from Córdoba fought its way toward the river and burned or captured some of the ships on which the invaders depended. Now the Northmen were back. The old route still offered everything a raiding fleet needed: a navigable river, a wealthy city, abundant food, and access to the interior. But once the ships crossed the estuary, the river would begin to narrow behind them. If Seville fell quickly, the Vikings could establish another base. If it held, every mile upstream would place the fleet deeper inside a defended waterway. And this time, movement had already begun on the Andalusi side. Warnings travelled inland before the attackers reached their objective. Warships and smaller craft could move toward the river approaches. Troops could follow the banks, while a fortified garrison held Seville long enough for reinforcements to gather. The Vikings had built their reputation on arriving before an enemy understood what was happening. Here, they were approaching an enemy whose entire defensive system had been built around the memory of their last attack. The immediate decision carried the danger of the whole campaign. Push upriver, and the fleet might recover the greatest prize Vikings had ever taken in Al-Andalus, but it might also lose the road back to the sea. Turn away, and the expedition would have to search for weaker targets beyond Gibraltar, farther from repair, reinforcements, and home. That choice would send the survivors across the western Mediterranean for nearly 2 years. Towns would burn from Iberia to North Africa. A king would be captured, ships would be lost to combat, weather, and accumulated damage. Eventually, those still alive would have to return through the same narrow waters where the rulers of Córdoba could wait for them. But the trap at the Guadalquivir had not been built in 859. It began with a catastrophe 15 years earlier, when Al-Andalus first learned that the sea could deliver an army faster than any warning could travel. In the early 9th century, the Emirate of Córdoba controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. Its capital was among the largest and wealthiest cities in Western Europe. Roads, agricultural estates, provincial towns, and river traffic connected Córdoba to a territory that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Its rulers commanded cavalry, infantry, provincial levies, and the resources of an organized state. Yet its military system had been designed largely for dangers on land. The Umayyad emirs fought northern Christian kingdoms, suppressed revolts, watched ambitious frontier families, and moved armies along familiar roads. Coastal settlements had defenses, but the Atlantic was not the central theatre of war. Seville stood about 50 miles inland by the course of the Guadalquivir. The river made the city prosperous. Ships carried goods between its markets and the Atlantic, while the surrounding valley produced grain, olives, and other agricultural wealth. That same waterway, however, could carry an enemy past the defenses that guarded roads and land frontiers. Viking ships were especially suited to exploiting that weakness. Their shallow hulls allowed them to cross open water and then move into rivers. A raiding force did not need to transport horses, siege equipment, and provisions along a slow overland route. It could bring its warriors directly to a settlement, attack before local authorities understood the scale of the danger, and withdraw along the same waterway. In 844, Scandinavian raiders had already been operating around West Francia. After moving along the Atlantic coast, a fleet appeared before Lisbon, then a city of Al-Andalus near the mouth of the Tagus. Andalusi accounts give different numbers, but the most familiar tradition describes dozens of ships, perhaps accompanied by smaller boats. The number of warriors is unknown. Depending on the size and condition of the vessels, the fleet may have carried several thousand people, but any precise total would be guesswork. The raiders remained around Lisbon for nearly 2 weeks and fought several engagements with local Muslim forces. They did not capture and permanently occupy the city, but their presence gave the governor time to send a warning to Emir Abd al-Rahman II in Córdoba. The message announced a new kind of danger. It could not reveal where that danger would strike next. The Viking fleet left the Tagus and continued south. Ships traveling along the coast could choose among numerous river mouths and settlements, while officials on land had to report each sighting through a chain of provincial authorities. By the time Córdoba learned that the fleet had moved, the raiders could already be approaching another target. Their destination was the Gulf of Cadiz and the broad mouth of the Guadalquivir. Once inside the estuary, the Vikings began attacking river communities. They established themselves near the lower waterway, seized provisions, and moved against settlements such as Coria del Rio. Each success provided food, information, and captives. It also drew them farther inland, closer to Seville, and farther from the open ocean. At first, this appeared to be an advantage. The river carried the fleet directly through the fertile heart of the region. The ships remained close enough to support the raiding parties, and the attackers could move without waiting for roads or bridges. Local forces, meanwhile, had to determine where the Vikings would land and then approach overland. Seville had not been prepared for a fleet of this size to arrive from downstream. The city possessed important buildings and defensive positions, but its protection was insufficient for the crisis unfolding around it. As news of the Viking advance spread, many inhabitants fled. Some sought safety in Carmona, a strongly positioned town to the east. Others remained behind, either because they could not leave in time or because they expected local resistance to hold. It did not hold. The Vikings entered Seville and captured much of the city. The exact limits of their control are uncertain. Some fortified positions may have resisted, and accounts differ over what happened to the principal mosque and citadel. What is clear is that the raiders gained enough control to use Seville as an operating base. For people outside the occupied districts, the situation would have been difficult to understand in full. Refugees carried reports toward Carmona and other secure places, but those reports reflected only the streets and riverbanks they had seen. Provincial officials had to decide whether the Vikings intended to remain, move toward Córdoba, or divide into smaller raiding groups. A force sent toward the wrong crossing could arrive after the ships had shifted position, while waiting for reliable information allowed the occupation to deepen. The Vikings benefited from that uncertainty. They did not need to administer Seville as a conquered province. They needed only enough control to unload men, secure prisoners, gather provisions, and send parties into the valley. The river connected those scattered operations to the fleet, allowing a group under pressure to withdraw toward the ships while another struck elsewhere. Until Córdoba concentrated a much larger force, local defenders were reacting to separate attacks without knowing which one represented the main danger. Yet the same dispersion began to stretch Viking command. A party moving through farmland could not see what was happening in Seville. Men guarding captives could not reinforce the riverbank without leaving those prisoners unsecured. Crews remaining aboard ship had to protect the expedition's only route home, while other warriors pursued the wealth that made the voyage worthwhile. The occupation appeared strongest when the raiders were spread across the largest area, but that was also when its separate parts were easiest to isolate. The city's capture changed the scale of the attack. This was no longer a landing followed by a quick retreat. Viking groups spread into the countryside, taking livestock, provisions, valuables, and prisoners. Captives could be held for ransom, carried away for sale, or used to gather information about nearby settlements. Storehouses and houses offered supplies that the fleet could never have transported across the Atlantic. For the Vikings, remaining at Seville offered enormous rewards. It also created a danger that grew with every passing day. A raiding fleet survived through speed. It struck before an enemy concentrated and left before a larger force arrived. By occupying Seville, the Vikings had exchanged some of their mobility for access to a rich city. Their ships still gave them a route back to the Atlantic, but only so long as the river remained open. In Córdoba, Abd al-Rahman II began mobilizing the resources of the emirate. He did not depend upon the local forces that had already failed. Orders went out to commanders, provincial officials, household troops, and districts capable of supplying infantry and cavalry. The Andalusi accounts preserve several names associated with the response. One was Isa ibn Shuhayd, a senior figure entrusted with organizing the campaign. Other commanders included Abd al-Wahid ibn Yazid al-Iskandarani and Muhammad ibn Sa'id ibn Rustum. Later traditions also associate Musa ibn Musa of the powerful Banu Qasi family with the relief effort, although the precise composition of the army remains uncertain. The force moving towards Seville was not a single uniform army. It likely included Umayyad household troops, provincial contingents, cavalry, infantry, missile troops, local volunteers, and men supplied by influential families. Its exact size is unknown. Its importance came from accumulation. Each arriving contingent reduced the Vikings' freedom to disperse, while the defenders operated close to friendly roads, settlements, and supply sources. The first engagements did not immediately settle the campaign. The Vikings still controlled parts of Seville and could concentrate men near their vessels when threatened. Their opponents needed more than a battlefield victory. If the fleet escaped intact, the raiders could simply move downriver and attack elsewhere. The Andalusi commanders therefore placed growing pressure on the connection between the occupation force and its ships. Cavalry could move quickly against Viking parties crossing open country. Infantry and missile troops could approach the areas where vessels had been beached or anchored. The raiders, who had spread out to gather food and captives, now had to return toward the river. Information would have moved unevenly. A Viking group several miles from Seville might learn that a Muslim army had arrived only when riders appeared or fugitives reached them. Men returning with loot could not know which landing points remained secure. Those near the ships could see only their part of the battlefield. A fleet that had gained its advantage by dispersing suddenly needed to gather before its separate groups were destroyed. By early November, the struggle was moving toward a decisive confrontation near Taliata, south of Seville. The exact location and course of the battle cannot be reconstructed in detail, and the surviving chronicles disagree over whether the main victory occurred on November 11 or November 17. But the strategic situation is much clearer. The Vikings needed to hold their route to the vessels. The Andalusi army needed to make that route impossible to use safely. When the forces met, the Northmen could rely on the weapons and methods that had served them across Western Europe. Spears were probably the most common battlefield weapon, supported by axes, swords, bows, and round wooden shields. Wealthier warriors may have worn mail and helmets, but the image of an entire army covered in heavy armor belongs more to modern imagination than 9th century reality. In a concentrated position, Viking warriors could create a hard defensive line around their banners, leaders, and access to the river. Yet they were not fighting on a chosen field with secure flanks. Some men were returning from raids, others were guarding ships or prisoners. Loot that had justified the occupation now hindered movement. The river behind them offered escape, but it also compressed the space in which they could maneuver. The Andalusi forces brought a different set of advantages. Cavalry could threaten exposed groups, pursue men withdrawing toward the ships, and carry information between different parts of the army. Missile troops could attack from beyond the reach of the Viking spear line. Most important, reinforcements continued to arrive while Viking losses could not be replaced. The medieval Muslim accounts claim that large numbers of Northmen died in the fighting. Some give totals in the hundreds or more, describe Viking commanders among the dead, and report the capture or destruction of numerous vessels. Such figures belong to a victory tradition and cannot be treated as precise records. The broad outcome, however, is not in doubt. The Andalusi army broke the Viking hold on Seville. Fire was used against some of the ships. Later retellings sometimes call the weapon Greek fire, but the evidence supports only the use of incendiary projectiles or burning materials, not possession of the closely guarded Byzantine formula. Even ordinary fire could be devastating against vessels containing dry wood, rope, sails, and supplies. Smoke would have obscured the riverbank, while crews tried to push ships into the current or prevent flames from spreading. A warrior who reached the water still needed a seaworthy vessel with enough men to handle it. If a ship had been burned, captured, or left without a crew, its survivors had to find room elsewhere. That reduced the fleet's capacity, just as the attackers were attempting to evacuate prisoners and loot. The Vikings abandoned the occupation and moved down the Guadalquivir. Andalusi forces had retaken Seville and prevented the raiders from advancing toward Córdoba. Some survivors continued attacking settlements as they withdrew, but the great opportunity created by the city's fall had ended. The victory brought relief, not security. The enemy had revealed a path into the interior that could not be erased from the map. The Guadalquivir would remain navigable, and Seville would remain wealthy. Another fleet could return whenever its commanders believed the defences had again become careless. Abd al-Rahman II responded by changing those defences. The government strengthened Seville's fortifications. A tradition preserved by Ibn Hayyan connects the jurist Ibn Habib with advice to surround the city with a wall. The exact sequence of construction is uncertain, but the strategic purpose is clear. A fortified city did not have to defeat a Viking fleet by itself. It had to prevent rapid capture and buy enough time for Córdoba to concentrate its superior resources. Walls alone were not sufficient. If the emirate waited behind fortifications while raiders moved freely along its coast and rivers, exposed communities would continue to suffer. The government therefore expanded its naval capacity at Seville. Building ships required a permanent network of labor and supplies. Timber had to be obtained and shaped. Iron fittings, rope, sails, oars, weapons, and provisions had to be stored. Crews required training, and pilots needed experience with the channels and tides of the river mouth. A vessel built during an emergency might arrive too late. A maintained naval force could move as soon as warnings reached the city. The defense also depended on information. Coastal governors and local officials needed to report unfamiliar fleets, track their direction, and warn the interior. This should not be imagined as a perfectly continuous line of towers able to identify every ship. Medieval communication remained vulnerable to delay and confusion, but even an imperfect system could provide the hours or days that had been missing in 844. The measures created after the attack represented an unusual kind of victory. The Vikings had been driven away, but they had also forced the emirate to invest in a new military frontier facing the sea. For several years, no equally large northern fleet returned. Abd al-Rahman II died in 852 and was succeeded by his son, Muhammad I. The new emir inherited a state facing multiple pressures. Córdoba remained in conflict with northern Christian powers. Regional lords guarded their own ambitions. Internal tensions that would later develop into serious rebellions already competed for the government's attention. Navies are expensive during years of peace. Ships decay, crews disperse, stores are consumed, and officials find other uses for money. Muhammad could have allowed the emergency system created after 844 to fade. He did not. Seville's defences and the Emirates' maritime capacity remained part of the military structure he inherited. That decision became important around 859, when another large Viking force left the waters of West Francia and sailed toward Iberia. Later traditions would describe the expedition under Bjorn Ironside and Hastein, two figures who became surrounded by legend. A Viking leader named Berno, or Bjorn, does appear in contemporary Frankish records during the 850s, but those records do not securely identify him as commander of this voyage. Hastein's role is even less certain. The safest evidence concerns the fleet rather than its leaders. Frankish, Iberian, and Muslim traditions agree that a major northern expedition reached Iberia and entered the Mediterranean. The frequently repeated number of 62 ships may preserve a genuine memory, but it should be treated as approximate. We do not know the number of warriors aboard. The men who joined the expedition were probably not sailing directly from Scandinavian farms into unknown waters. Many may have spent years around West Francia, using river bases, trading, extorting payment, and fighting Frankish armies. They understood long-distance raiding as both warfare and business. Ships belonged to different leaders, and crews could cooperate for one target before separating for another. Their immediate challenge was the Bay of Biscay. Atlantic storms could scatter a fleet before any enemy appeared. Ships needed fresh water, food, and repairs along the way. Every landing offered an opportunity to resupply, but every landing also warned the next region that the Northmen were coming. When the fleet reached Galicia, it encountered resistance. The Chronicle of Albelda states briefly that the Northmen returned for a second time and were defeated on the coast by a Count Pedro. Later writers have identified him as Pedro Theon, but the early source does not provide enough information to make that certain. Claims that exactly 38 Viking ships were destroyed are also much less secure than modern retellings often suggest. The important fact is that the fleet suffered opposition and continued. Whatever losses occurred in Galicia were not enough to end the expedition. The survivors moved along Iberia, searching for provisions, captives, and a profitable objective. Around the same period, Vikings captured Garcia Iñiguez, ruler of Pamplona. The incident is probably connected with the expedition of 859 or 860, though its exact place in the route remains uncertain. Pamplona lay inland, and the sources do not tell us enough to reconstruct how the raiders reached the king or under what circumstances he was taken. Later accounts describe a huge ransom, sometimes 70 or 90,000 gold dinars. The amount may be exaggerated, but the capture itself was a major political shock. A ruler accustomed to balancing relations with Asturias, Córdoba, and the Banu Qasi had been seized by an enemy arriving from a maritime world beyond those rivalries. For the Viking fleet, a royal captive offered wealth without permanent conquest. For everyone else in Iberia, the episode showed how difficult the raiders were to predict. They could appear on a coast, move inland, seize a person of enormous value, and then return to their ships before neighboring powers coordinated. As the expedition turned toward Muslim territory, warnings moved ahead of it. Officials along the western coast did not know whether the fleet would attack Lisbon, the Algarve, the Gulf of Cadiz, or the Guadalquivir. Preparing every possible target was impossible. The government had to protect the route toward the region whose loss would cause the greatest damage. At Córdoba, Muhammad I could act before Seville fell. The reports reaching his court were probably incomplete. A coastal official might confirm the presence of northern ships without knowing whether the entire fleet remained together. News of fighting in Galicia could arrive after the raiders had already passed Portugal. No messenger could tell Muhammad with certainty whether the enemy intended to enter the Guadalquivir or merely threaten it while another group attacked elsewhere. The emir therefore had to make his decision before the Vikings revealed their full plan. He could spread his forces along the coast, protecting more settlements but leaving no position strong enough to stop a concentrated fleet. Or he could defend the route to Seville, accepting that towns outside that shield might be exposed. The reforms made after 844 pointed toward the second choice. Seville was not simply another target. It was the gateway to the Guadalquivir Valley, a naval center, a storehouse of regional wealth, and the position from which raiders might again threaten the interior. Preparations near the river had several connected parts. Ships could watch the estuary and contest the channels. Troops on land could shadow any fleet moving upstream and threaten the places where crews came ashore. The garrison did not have to defeat thousands of raiders outside the walls. It needed to deny them a sudden entrance. Every delay allowed more men to arrive from surrounding districts and made the Vikings' escape more difficult. This was a different form of command from the emergency response of 844. Muhammad did not need to guess which force could retake a city already lost. He needed to place enough resistance in the Vikings' path that they would choose not to risk taking it at all. The success of the defense would therefore be measured partly by a battle that never happened. No second occupation, no weeks of raiding from inside Seville, and no desperate army arriving after the disaster. This was the first decisive difference from 844. During the earlier invasion, the emirate had concentrated its army after the Vikings occupied the city. Now naval and land forces could prepare around the river approaches, while Seville's garrison relied on strengthened walls. The Vikings still had reasons to attempt the Guadalquivir. Their predecessors had demonstrated what the river could offer. Seville remained wealthy, and control of the city would give the fleet a protected base deep inside an agricultural region. If the Vikings could enter quickly and reproduce the local panic of 844, the defensive reforms might not matter. But the old route now carried new dangers. The estuary narrowed as ships moved inland. Local pilots knew its channels, currents, anchorages, and shallows. Andalusi vessels could operate close to their supply base. Land forces could follow the banks and threaten landing parties. Most important, the city at the end of the route could no longer be taken simply because its inhabitants had too little time to react. The surviving accounts do not allow us to reconstruct one great second Battle of Seville. There is no trustworthy sequence of named commanders, exact formations, and daily assaults. What they do preserve is the failure of the returning Vikings to repeat their earlier occupation and the effective resistance organized under Muhammad I. That failure probably emerged through a series of connected frustrations rather than one dramatic collision. Landing parties found defenders already assembling. Ships entering the river faced the possibility of attack from Andalusi vessels and from troops along the banks. Any movement towards Seville carried the fleet deeper into confined water. When the raiders approached the city, its defences denied them the quick entry they required. A fortified garrison did not need to chase the Vikings into the countryside. It needed to hold the walls. Each hour it remained intact favoured the emirate, because messengers could bring more men and more ships into the threatened region. The Viking commanders therefore faced a calculation that had not existed in 844. A prolonged siege was poorly suited to a mobile raiding expedition. Their ships had limited stores. They carried no large siege train, and crews committed to an assault could not simultaneously guard every vessel, forage for food, and watch the river behind them. If Andalusi ships closed the route downstream, Seville could become a trap rather than a prize. Remaining promised wealth if the city suddenly broke. It also risked losing the entire fleet. The Vikings withdrew from the attempt. The surviving sources compress this reversal so tightly that the most important moment can be easy to miss. The Vikings had crossed hundreds of miles of dangerous coast to reach a place associated with an earlier triumph. They now had to abandon that objective without the decisive victory or mass of captives that would justify lingering in the Guadalquivir. They had not been beaten in one famous clash. Their choices had been narrowed until withdrawal became safer than success was likely. For the crews inside the estuary, leaving required its own coordination. Landing parties had to be recalled before Andalusi cavalry isolated them. Water and food taken ashore had to be loaded or abandoned. Ships spread across different channels needed to assemble without colliding or grounding in unfamiliar shallows. No captain could know exactly when the defenders might close from downstream, and waiting for a missing group risked every vessel still upriver. The Andalusi commanders faced a restraint of their own. Pursuing too aggressively could bring their lighter or less heavily manned vessels within boarding distance. Viking crews who could not capture a walled city were still extremely dangerous in close combat. The defenders' advantage lay in pressure, missiles, knowledge of the water, and the arrival of reinforcements, not in offering the Northmen the ship-to-ship melee they wanted. The result was less visually simple than a line of infantry breaking on a battlefield, but strategically it was decisive. The defensive system worked as a system. The walls prevented a quick seizure. The garrison consumed time. The fleet threatened the river. Troops on shore restricted foraging. Information moving through the region brought more pressure with each passing day. No single measure would necessarily have stopped the Vikings. Together, they turned the river from an avenue of attack into a narrowing corridor with an intact fortress at its end. That decision preserved their expedition, but it marked the central strategic reversal of the campaign. 15 years earlier, capturing Seville had allowed Viking groups to spread across the valley. In 859, the city's survival denied them shelter, stores, captives, and the confidence to disperse. Their operational sequence had been broken before it could begin. Al-Andalus had not destroyed the fleet. It had made its most valuable target too dangerous to attack. The Vikings now had to find another source of profit. They moved toward the Strait of Gibraltar and the port of Algeciras. Unlike Seville, Algeciras stood directly on the coast. It could be approached rapidly, attacked, and abandoned without taking the fleet deep into a river system. The raiders struck the town and plundered it. Muslim accounts report that they burned its mosque. The attack showed the limits of Córdoba's preparedness. A state could strengthen major cities and station ships at strategic waterways, but it could not place an army behind every beach. the same defensive concentration that protected Seville left smaller or more exposed targets vulnerable. Algeciras gave the Vikings loot and perhaps supplies, but not a secure base. Andalusi forces could follow their movements, and remaining near the strait would allow the emirate to bring more ships into the area. The Viking leaders now had two broad choices. They could turn west and return to the Atlantic after a disappointing but survivable campaign, or they could pass through Gibraltar into a sea where few Scandinavian fleets had operated. They chose the Mediterranean. The Strait of Gibraltar appears narrow on a map, but it is not easy water. Surface currents generally carry Atlantic water eastward, while winds can rapidly change the conditions for vessels dependent upon both sail and oar. High ground on either shore made approaching ships visible. A fleet damaged by storms or combat had to keep its vessels together while navigating unfamiliar coastal waters. Passing east solved one problem. It placed distance between the Vikings and the forces gathering around the Guadalquivir. It also created another. Every mile into the Mediterranean carried them farther from friendly bases, replacement crews, and established repair sites. The Annals of Saint-Bertin, written in West Francia, independently record that northern pirates passed through the strait and entered the Mediterranean. That agreement between Frankish and Arabic traditions provides one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the expedition. Whatever later legends added, the voyage itself was real. Once through Gibraltar, the fleet crossed toward North Africa. Its target was Nakur, a Muslim principality in the Rif region of what is now Morocco. Nakur was not merely another district ruled from Córdoba. It was a separate political center, connected to Mediterranean trade and close enough to Iberia for a rapid attack. The Vikings landed and occupied or ravaged the area for approximately 8 days. The length of their stay suggests that local resistance did not immediately force them back to sea. They seized captives, reportedly including members of prominent families. Such prisoners were valuable because relatives or rulers might pay far more for them than an ordinary captive would bring in a slave market. For several days, the expedition achieved the kind of success denied at Seville. Yet this success carried its own burden. Captives required guards, food, and space aboard ship. Loot had to be loaded and protected. Landing parties moving inland could not remain indefinitely while local forces assembled. The Vikings left Nakur and continued through the western Mediterranean. Their next movements brought them towards southeastern Al-Andalus and the district around Orihuela. This coast presented a different military environment from the Guadalquivir. Orihuela lay inland from the Mediterranean near the lower Segura River, within a productive agricultural region. It did not possess the same concentration of naval defences as Seville. Viking forces could land, move through waterways or over land, and attack communities before Córdoba concentrated a major response. The raid inflicted damage and produced more loot or captives, but it did not produce a permanent base. The surviving sources do not describe a reliable pitched battle at Orihuela, nor do they provide exact casualties. The raiders struck, gathered what they could, and moved again. Their mobility remained their protection. It was also becoming a necessity. They could attack places that were not ready, but they could not remain after defenders began to gather. Every successful landing therefore led to another departure. The fleet moved among or attacked the Balearic Islands. Medieval accounts do not allow a dependable island-by-island itinerary, though Majorca and other islands appear in later reconstructions. The islands offered water, livestock, provisions, and temporary anchorages. They also exposed the crews to the same recurring problem. Men had to leave the vessels to obtain supplies, while others remained behind to protect ships, prisoners, and accumulated wealth. By this stage, the expedition had already crossed the Bay of Biscay, fought in Iberia, passed Gibraltar, attacked North Africa, and returned to the Mediterranean coast of Spain. Hulls had been strained, sails damaged, and crews reduced by combat, sickness, accident, and detachment. Men lost along the route could not simply be replaced. The logical decision might have been to return immediately through Gibraltar. Instead, the fleet continued north, towards southern Francia. That choice transformed the expedition. It was no longer a single campaigning season aimed at Iberia. The Vikings were committing themselves to a long stay in the Mediterranean, where they would need to survive winter far from their Atlantic bases. They moved toward the lower Rhone and the marshy delta of the Camargue. The terrain offered advantages to a force dependent on ships. Channels, islands, and wetlands could make it difficult for heavy concentrations of cavalry to approach. From the delta, raiders could reach the Mediterranean coast and move inland along the Rhone system. But a winter base was not merely an anchorage. It had to feed hundreds or perhaps thousands of people every day. Ships needed repairs. Guards had to watch prisoners and supplies. Crews from different leaders had to maintain cooperation, even as the immediate promise of a rich target gave way to cold weather, sickness, and routine labor. A Viking ship was an exceptional instrument of war, but it was not a floating warehouse capable of sustaining a force for 2 years. Water spoiled or ran short. Grain and preserved food were consumed. Oars broke, sails tore, rope frayed, hulls leaked. Every repair depended upon access to suitable materials, and men who could work while part of the force protected them. The expedition survived by taking what it needed from the surrounding region. That necessity shaped almost every movement that followed. A profitable target was not automatically a useful one. Silver, church ornaments, fine cloth, and high-status prisoners could reward the expedition when it returned, but none of them could feed a crew that had exhausted its grain. A poorer agricultural settlement might be more valuable in the moment if it supplied animals, fresh water, timber, or sailcloth. Raiding decisions, therefore, had to balance immediate survival against the wealth the crews had come south to obtain. The same problem affected cohesion. The fleet was probably a coalition of ships owing loyalty to different leaders rather than a single navy receiving orders from one permanent admiral. One group might wish to continue toward Italy, another might prefer to return with what it had already taken. A damaged ship slowed everyone if the fleet stayed together, but abandoning it meant redistributing its crew and cargo. The farther they traveled, the harder it became to ensure that every captain accepted the same risk for the same reward. Captives further complicated the calculation. Important prisoners could bring large ransoms, yet they required guards and provisions and might attempt escape during a landing or battle. Ordinary captives could be sold, but only if the raiders reached a market or returned to a region where buyers were available. What looked like wealth on the day of capture could become another logistical burden during a winter far from home. For that reason, the months in the Mediterranean should not be imagined as an uninterrupted sequence of triumphant attacks. Much of the expedition's survival depended on repairing, searching, negotiating, waiting for weather, and deciding which ships were still capable of continuing. Those quieter decisions determined how much force remained when the fleet finally turned back toward Gibraltar. When campaigning resumed, Viking parties struck places along the coast and lower Rhone. Sources associate the expedition with attacks around Narbonne, Nîmes, Arles, and possibly farther inland. Not every claimed movement can be dated precisely, but the pattern is clear. The fleet used rivers and coastal waters to find new targets, while its temporary base supported repeated raids. From a distance, the growing list of attacked towns makes the expedition appear increasingly successful. The Vikings had failed at Seville, yet they had reached North Africa, the Balearics, and southern Francia. They continued taking wealth and demonstrating an extraordinary operational range. Inside the expedition, each success reduced resources that could not be restored. A wounded warrior still required food. A dead rower weakened a crew. A captured horse or chest of silver could increase profit, but it could not repair a steering oar in a storm. Ships damaged beyond local repair had to be abandoned, and their crews redistributed among the remaining vessels. The raiders could replace food through plunder. They could not easily replace trained manpower or seaworthy hulls. Later Norman tradition carries the fleet from southern Francia to the Italian coast. The best-known story concerns the city of Luni. According to the tale, Hastin believed the city to be Rome and decided that its walls could not be taken by direct attack. He pretended to be dying, requested Christian baptism and burial inside the city, then emerged from his funeral bier while concealed warriors seized the gates. It is a memorable story, but it cannot be narrated as established history. The account was written long after the expedition and contains familiar literary devices: false conversion, feigned death, concealed weapons, and a city deceived from within. Luni had also suffered attacks by Muslim raiders, creating further possibilities for confusion among later traditions. The real voyage required no invented coffin to remain extraordinary. A northern fleet had passed from Atlantic waters into the Mediterranean, operated across several political worlds, and survived far from its original bases. Whether it attacked Luni in the manner later described is much less certain. Eventually, the surviving crews had to turn west. By around 860 or 861, the expedition had been away for many months. It carried captives, movable wealth, and stories that would grow in the telling. It also carried wounded men and operated ships that had endured storms, beachings, battle damage, and continuous use. To return to West Francia, the fleet had only one exit from the Mediterranean. It had to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar and sail once again along the southern coast of Al-Andalus. This gave Muhammad I an advantage that did not depend on pursuing the Vikings across thousands of miles. The emirate could not know every town they would attack in the Mediterranean. It could know where they eventually had to reappear. The Viking commanders had gained distance from the Andalusi fleet by sailing east. On the return journey, that distance became a corridor narrowing toward a defended choke point. Their destination was predictable, while the timing remained the principal uncertainty. The surviving accounts disagree sharply over what happened next. Some Muslim traditions claim that Andalusi forces destroyed a large part of the returning Viking fleet, with figures as high as 40 ships. Other accounts describe only 2 vessels burned or captured near the southern Iberian coast. Frankish evidence indicates that only a portion of the original expedition returned, but it does not allow every missing ship to be assigned to one battle. Storms, fighting in Galicia, clashes around Al-Andalus, Mediterranean operations, accidents, sickness, and ships detached from the main force may all have contributed. The figures should not be combined into a neat equation in which 62 ships departed, exactly 40 were destroyed, and 22 returned. Medieval chroniclers were not counting from one shared fleet register. The most defensible reconstruction is that a reduced Viking force approached Gibraltar and encountered an Andalusi naval response near the southern coast, perhaps in waters connected with Medina Sidonia. The defenders used their local knowledge, ships, and shore support to attack an expedition already weakened by its long voyage. The approach placed both sides under different kinds of uncertainty. Andalusi commanders could predict the route, but not the exact condition or arrival time of the enemy. Keeping ships ready consumed food and manpower, and a fleet waiting in the wrong harbour could miss the Vikings completely. Coastal reports therefore mattered as much as the vessels themselves. Each sighting could narrow the area in which the defenders needed to concentrate. The Vikings knew the danger more generally, but could not know where the blow would fall. They might attempt the passage in poor weather to reduce the chance of interception, but difficult winds and currents would make damaged ships harder to control. They might wait for better conditions, but remaining near the coast allowed more Andalusi forces to assemble. Once again, time favoured the state with nearby ports and fresh crews. Naval combat in the 9th century was an unstable mixture of maneuver, missile fire, boarding, and attacks against ships near shore. Andalusi vessels did not need to imitate Viking longships. Operating close to their own ports, they could carry missile troops and incendiary materials while using pilots familiar with local currents. The Vikings remained dangerous at close range. If their ships came alongside an opponent, experienced warriors could board and turn the fight into hand-to-hand combat. The Andalusi crews therefore had reason to strike from a distance before closing. Incendiary projectiles were especially threatening. A burning pot or mass of flaming material did not need to sink a vessel immediately. It could ignite rope, sails, supplies, or wooden structures and force the crew to abandon its position. Men trying to extinguish flames could not row, maneuver, or defend against boarding. Smoke would have made coordination more difficult. A ship moving with the current could lose contact with others. Damaged vessels would fall behind, while those ahead had to decide whether to turn back or preserve their own escape. Captives and accumulated cargo reduced space and complicated any attempt to transfer survivors from one ship to another. The strait magnified every failure in communication. Orders could be given by horn, shouted signals, flags, or the movement of a commander's own ship, but smoke and separation could make those signals impossible to read. A captain at the front might see open water ahead and continue west, unaware that another vessel had lost its steering oar. Men aboard a burning ship might expect nearby crews to help, while those crews saw only an Andalusi vessel preparing to close. There was no shore to which the entire force could safely withdraw and reorganize. Nor did the defenders have complete control. Incendiaries could miss, fail to catch, or be extinguished. A ship carried too close by current or wind could be boarded. Andalusi success depended on keeping enough distance to use missiles while denying the Vikings space to gather for a concentrated counterattack. The encounter was therefore a contest of position and endurance as much as courage. The northern crews needed only to force a route west. The defenders needed to damage as many ships as possible before that route opened into the Atlantic. Some Viking ships were burned or captured. Others escaped toward the Atlantic. The exact scale of the destruction cannot be recovered, but the fleet that emerged from Gibraltar was only a remnant of the force remembered at the beginning of the expedition. This encounter completed the transformation that had begun after 844. During the first attack, Córdoba had learned of the crisis, while Seville was already falling. Around 861, its forces were attempting to intercept the enemy at sea, before that enemy could turn the return voyage into another round of attacks. The change did not belong to one dramatic commander standing on a deck. It came from a series of decisions made across 15 years, fortifying Seville, maintaining shipyards, storing equipment, supporting crews, preserving coastal communications, and treating the Atlantic as a permanent military frontier. The surviving Vikings reached the ocean and continued north. Their final numbers are unknown. Some ships may have returned to bases in West Francia around 861 or 862. Others may have separated, been lost, or remained elsewhere. Those who returned could still claim extraordinary achievements. They had sailed around the Iberian Peninsula, crossed Gibraltar, attacked lands in North Africa and the Mediterranean, wintered near the Rhone, and perhaps reached Italy. They may have brought back captives and enough wealth to reward at least some of the crews. Yet the campaign had not produced conquest. No Viking territory survived in Al-Andalus, North Africa, southern Francia, or Italy as a result of this voyage. Every base had been temporary, and every occupation had ended when local forces became too strong or supplies forced another movement. Judging the expedition requires separating tactical success from strategic result. The Vikings successfully attacked exposed communities. Algeciras was plundered. Nakua suffered occupation and the loss of captives. The district around Orihuela was raided. Other settlements across the western Mediterranean were damaged. The fleet was not destroyed at the first appearance of Andalusi warships, and at least some crews returned with profit. Córdoba, however, had set a different objective. It did not need to protect every mile of coastline to prevent a repetition of 844. It needed to keep Seville from becoming a Viking base, secure the Guadalquivir, and ensure that a northern fleet could no longer move toward the interior without organized resistance. By that measure, the defensive system succeeded. Seville did not fall. Córdoba was never threatened directly. The Vikings were pushed towards smaller coastal targets and then into the Mediterranean, where distance and attrition steadily weakened them. On their return, Andalusi forces were prepared to attack along the route they had to use. The success came with a harsher consequence for peripheral communities. Strengthening Seville did not make Algeciras, Orihuela, or every fishing settlement equally secure. Defense concentrated around strategic centers often redirected violence rather than eliminating it. People living beyond those centers paid for the survival of the places the government had chosen to protect most heavily. For the Umayyad state, the experience confirmed the value of permanent naval power. Seville's shipbuilding and maritime organization became part of a broader capacity to operate in the Western Mediterranean and defend the Atlantic approaches. Later rulers could draw upon institutions whose urgency had first been demonstrated by the burning and occupation of 844. Northern fleets would appear again. In 966, another important Viking threat reached the western coast of Al-Andalus, and the government again mobilized ships and commanders. By then, maritime defense was no longer an improvised reaction to an unimaginable attack. It had become an expected responsibility of the state. The contrast with other parts of Europe is revealing. Scandinavian armies settled in Ireland, conquered territory in England, and eventually transformed political life in Normandy. They built enduring communities where they could reinforce their numbers, cultivate land, negotiate with local rulers, and hold fortified bases. The conditions in Al-Andalus were different. Its cities were numerous and increasingly defended. Cavalry could pursue landing parties. An organized government could draw troops from several provinces. Naval forces could contest rivers and coastal waters. Most important, Viking groups operating south of the Bay of Biscay had no reliable stream of settlers and reinforcements behind them. A fleet could burn a town. Holding the surrounding territory required something much larger. The expedition also entered cultural memory in different forms. Muslim writers called the northern raiders al-Majus, a term associated with Magians or fire worshippers. It did not reflect a precise understanding of Norse religion. It served as an inherited label for pagan outsiders whose ships appeared from the ocean. In later European tradition, uncertain commanders became legendary sons of famous kings. Real raids acquired false funerals, deceptive conversions, and mistaken attacks on Rome. The distance traveled by the fleet was so remarkable that later writers found it easy to attach one more city, one more trick, or one more heroic name. Beneath those legends lies a more consequential story. In 844, the Vikings had discovered a weakness. They entered the Guadalquivir before the emirate could concentrate, captured Seville, and forced Córdoba to fight for one of its principal cities. Their victory came from mobility, surprise, and the defenders' failure to recognize the river as a military frontier. The rulers of Al-Andalus could not remove the river, hide the wealth of Seville, or prevent northern sailors from crossing the Atlantic. What they could do was change what the raiders found when they arrived. Walls denied immediate entry. A garrison gained time. Messengers brought warnings. Shipyards made naval response possible. Local pilots turned familiar channels into defended water. Reinforcements could gather while the attackers remained outside the city. None of those measures guaranteed safety. Together, they changed the decision facing the Viking commanders. In 844, remaining near Seville promised more wealth. In 859, remaining threatened the survival of the fleet. That difference was the real victory. The Vikings had not lost their courage, their ships, or their ability to appear where no one expected them. They crossed seas that few Western European armies could imagine navigating and continued fighting after their original objective had been denied. What they had lost was the advantage that mattered most: surprise. 15 years earlier, the Guadalquivir had carried them toward an exposed city. When they returned, it carried them toward walls, warships, and an enemy that remembered. The Vikings had come back to Muslim Spain. But this time, Al-Andalus was ready.